Let's travel back to the 2002 SARS outbreak. If you didn't know already, SARS is a viral respiratory illness in the corona family and presents as an atypical pneumonia but doesn't respond to standard treatments. Between 2002 and 2003, SARS spread to 24 countries. 8,000 people worldwide were said to have contracted the virus, and of those 8,800 died. The United States government responded by funding a collaboration between Chinese scientists and the U.S. military from the Bioweapons Lab at Fort Detrick in Maryland, an institution which was the center of the biological weapons program and was established during the Second World War. Fort Detrick served as home to some of the government's darkest experiments on unwitting American citizens and prisoners. The biological weapons program, in conjunction with the military and the CIA, gave us some of our most well-documented greatest hits, like the CIA's MKUltra mind control program, which used chemical substances and brainwashing techniques to completely control a subject. Or like I've talked about in previous videos, Operation Sea Spray, which took place in 1950 with the U.S. Navy spraying harmful bacteria into the air about 2 miles off the California coast, in order to determine the susceptibility of a large city like San Francisco to a bioweapon attack. Of course, these are just 2 examples, but there are many more. I'm using these examples to illustrate that there is an established history of the United States government unleashing bioweapons on ordinary citizens, doing objectively awful human experimentation and attempting to justify it under the guise of national security. These institutions, these programs, and these alphabet agencies operate the way they do because they know they have almost total immunity. Not a critique, just an assessment of history and of reality. So back to 2002. Chinese scientists and a team led by a guy we know pretty well by now, Dr. Anthony Fauci, partnered up to prevent future SARS outbreaks by studying the virus strains from bats and human tissues. In this whole process, they created in a lab, produced what they called pandemic superbugs that were more lethal than the strains of the virus found in nature. This alarmed researchers who were following these studies because, hey, what happens when the superbug escapes the lab? What then? At least that was the concern echoed in a New York Times article about Dr. Fauci's research. And Fauci was the target of quite a bit of criticism, with one Harvard doctor telling Times Magazine that Fauci's experiments basically weaponized the virus instead of preventing a future pandemic, which preventing a future pandemic was the stated objective. You know, keep people safe instead of putting them in harm's way. That's why his team got all those taxpayer dollars. Over the years, there were various incidents with reported mishaps that almost released this deadly superbug. And in 2014, President Obama stopped Fauci's federal funding, in the United States, that is. But those federal restrictions were dodged in one clever maneuver, by shifting all of the research to a military lab in another country, the military lab in Wuhan, China. Back in 2008, the United States Embassy was established in Wuhan. In 2014, the same year that Obama stopped Fauci's federal funding in the United States, the funding of the same research shifted to a laboratory in Wuhan, where the money rolled in the form of grants. Some numbers have been tossed around in the media and at White House briefings. $3.7 million over the span of several years, all the way up to $7.4 million. The reality is, that's the money we know about, but there is a high likelihood it is much, much more. Reports have shown that researchers traveled 1,000 miles away to the caves of Yunnan to obtain the bats. And the crazy thing is, they traveled 1,000 miles to basically violate all these bats in these caves, and they took rectal swabs from them and harvested the virus. Honestly, who comes up with this stuff? Who is sitting around at the Monday meeting giving orders to go spelunking for bats, and then proceeding to give these bats rectal swabs? Perhaps the more important question is, why does the United States have an embassy right in the heart of Wuhan? And why is the United States funding bat rectal swab research in another country? The theory surrounding these questions deals with the CIA, who knew China was emerging as a serious competitor. And the United States funded this lab so they could keep an eye on what the Chinese were up to. And the Chinese gladly took the cash and America's bioweapon secrets. CIA, China, no one's a victim here, just opportunistic predators. But let's get back to the timeline and the facts. Delivered just days before Trump was inaugurated in January of 2017, Dr. Fauci warned of a surprise outbreak. He said there is no question that there will be a challenge to the coming administration in the arena of infectious diseases. The culmination of all of the aforementioned material rests in the shackled hands of Dr. Charles Lieber. Court documents released by the United States Justice Department have revealed that Dr. Lieber, the chair of the Department of Chemistry and Chemical Biology at Harvard University, has received more than $15 million in grant funding from the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Defense. These grants require the disclosure of significant foreign financial conflicts of interest, including financial support from foreign governments or foreign entities. Well, Lieber didn't actually disclose all of his relationships because, unbeknownst to Harvard University beginning in 2011, Lieber became a strategic scientist at Wuhan University of Technology in China. A classic case of double-dipping and treasonous behavior. But wait, there's more. The Wuhan University of Technology paid Lieber $50,000 per month with living expenses. And he was awarded $1.5 million to establish a research lab at the university. But old Lieber never disclosed this relationship to his American colleagues. Also arrested alongside Lieber was a lieutenant of the People's Liberation Army and member of the Chinese Communist Party, who was posing as a student at Boston University. Somehow, she had accessed U.S. military websites, researched U.S. military projects, and compiled information while in the United States and sent it right along to the People's Liberation Army. So the Harvard professor was a double agent, the Boston student was a Chinese spy, and our last arrest was the carrier pigeon. Another Chinese national who was posing as a cancer researcher in Boston was arrested at the airport on December 9th, 2019, boarding a flight bound for China. He was arrested attempting to smuggle 21 vials of biological material to China. Aside from our three musketeers here, to further complicate matters for Harvard, recent reports detail that our favorite Mossad blackmailer who didn't kill himself, Jeffrey Epstein, actually had his own office, key card, and dedicated phone line at Harvard. He had donated millions and millions of dollars over the span of 25 years to the university. And Epstein had a specific interest in infectious diseases, or at least that's where the bulk of his donations went, as his foundation pledged $30 million to establish the Program for Evolutionary Dynamics at Harvard, which studies evolution, cancer, and viruses. Not only did Epstein manage his own money, but he directed donations made by many famous billionaires, like Bill Gates, whom Epstein had a personal relationship with long after Epstein was convicted as a sex offender. And we cannot forget that at the same time the World Military Games were taking place in Wuhan, the Gates Foundation hosted Event 201 in New York, detailing a novel coronavirus that manifests as a pandemic globally, killing millions. And since the start of these events we've seen play out in 2020, Bill Gates, despite not being an elected official, holding a medical degree, or even graduating from college, has been the go-to authority on all pandemic-related discussion in the media. But never mentioned is how invested Bill Gates is in the cure, as he's currently building 7 factories for all the vaccines in production. This man couldn't even keep Microsoft Windows virus-free. Again, not my opinion, just a straight-up fact. So yes, during the second half of 2019, all of these events happened within just months of each other. Fort Detrick was shut down in August because of problems with the disposal of dangerous materials. In October, Event 201 was held and the World Military Games were hosted in China. Then a few weeks later, 2 Chinese nationals were arrested. One of them caught smuggling biological materials to China. And Dr. Lieber was arrested in tandem with his ties to China. Around the same time, the first case of corona was documented in Wuhan, with the official story being that it originated at a wet market just miles away from the Wuhan military laboratory. that the U.S. has been pumping grants into for the last decade and is in close proximity to the U.S. consulate. And even though the term wet market has the same CIA Mockingbird media aura as Grassy Knoll or Ground Zero, we are absolutely not allowed to question the official narrative on the internet because Susan over here on YouTube is banning anyone who goes against the WHO talking points, even though the WHO is clearly aligned with China. Twitter will ban your account if you suggest going outside and having fun, and Facebook fact-checkers and Snopes writers are working around the clock to debunk any claims that question the official wet market narrative. Again, none of what I just said is how I feel or my bias. These are substantiated claims and an untainted reflection of the reality in which we live. These major tech companies are the new ministry of truth, and as logical, reasonable people who have a platform to ask questions and present facts, our days are numbered on these platforms. You know, there is plenty of evidence that a virus didn't just organically originate in some wet market. That evidence is absolutely worthy of investigation and discussion because the ramifications and consequences of this virus have been historic. Never before has society all over the world been shut down on a micro and macro level. And there is evidence that something is happening under the cover of this pandemic. What we have witnessed is the pretext for a general reset, and we aren't even free to talk about it from the confines of our homes, where we have been instructed to self-quarantine since March. Why? No, really, why? There are plenty of authoritative voices who have attempted to question the narrative, and those voices have been censored into oblivion. They are the new lepers of our society, paraded across Mockingbird media headlines as dangerous individuals. We have a Nobel Prize-winning scientist who has been saying that corona was artificially created in a lab by scientists working on an AIDS vaccine, as he found out that the virus's sequence showed elements of HIV. He's not the only person saying the virus was created in a lab. In fact, on April 30th, President Donald Trump went against the information from the U.S. intelligence community by claiming that he has seen evidence that gives him a high degree of confidence the virus originated in a laboratory. So what are the implications of the timeline I've just laid out for you? From where I'm sitting, the facts demonstrate that big governments all over the world, including the United States government, historically have conducted biowarfare and psychological warfare experiments on citizens at home and abroad. And in doing so, they operate with near immunity. After patient zero was reported, media outlets everywhere were screaming about bats and wet markets, mind control terms like Grassy Knoll and Ground Zero, while big stories like Harvard's Charles Lieber were buried. As we dig into the moments leading up to patient zero and the fallout, we are greeted by a familiar cast of characters that I think we should refer to as the medical mafia henceforth, as they are people invested in the cause and the cure. And they are above questioning, as anyone who openly engages in the questioning of the WHO's allegiance or Bill Gates' billionaire depopulation efforts gets silenced. And any idea that conflicts with the mainstream media is labeled conspiracy theory, a CIA term from start to finish. The only implication I'm going to voice in this video is that the whole thing stinks, like an overcrowded wet market in August. What do you think, internet friends? You know, I always look forward to your comments. Thank you so much for watching, subscribing, and supporting my channel on Patreon. Bye!
Avoiding every threat. I wanna stay